They humiliated me in front of my daughter, stripped my dignity in one careless moment, and laughed as if I would never be more than the man they had already decided to erase. I remember the exact words they used, not because they were clever, but because they were spoken so casually. As if destroying someone in front of their own child was just another ordinary thing adults do when power makes them lazy. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't even defend myself. I stood there, feeling my daughter's eyes on my back, and understood something painful in that instant. This wasn't just about me anymore. My daughter was 16 then, old enough to understand disrespect, old enough to feel shame on behalf of a parent, young enough to believe the world is still fair if you just work hard and stay honest. That belief cracked right there, in a room full of people who smiled while doing something deeply wrong. It happened during what was supposed to be a simple family gathering. Nothing dramatic on the surface. Just voices, coffee cups, polite laughter. The kind of place where people pretend everything is fine while quietly measuring who holds power and who doesn't. David was there. So was Linda. Michael, too. All of them sitting comfortably, confident, secure. And me, invited, but not really welcome. The humiliation wasn't loud. That's the part people don't understand. Real humiliation is often delivered softly, calmly, with a smile. David made a remark about my failures, wrapped in humor so everyone could laugh without feeling guilty. Linda followed with a comment about how my daughter deserved better examples. Michael didn't say anything. He just watched. That silence hurt the most. I felt my daughter stiffen beside me. I didn't look at her right away. I already knew what I would see. Confusion first. Then embarrassment. Then the quiet question children are afraid to ask. Why didn't you stop them? Because stopping them would have given them what they wanted. A reaction. A scene. Proof that I was weak and emotional and exactly what they had already labeled me as. So I stayed quiet. I nodded once. I even smiled. That smile confused them. They thought it meant surrender. They thought it meant I had accepted my place. What it really meant was that I had just learned who they truly were, and how far they were willing to go when they believed no consequences existed. On the drive home, my daughter didn't speak at first. She stared out the window, arms crossed tightly, replaying the moment in her mind. I could feel her disappointment like weight in my chest. Not anger. Disappointment. That was worse. Finally, she asked, "Why did they talk to you like that?" I answered honestly. I said, "Because they think they can." She didn't reply. But something shifted between us that night. Not distance. Awareness. Children learn fast. She learned that dignity can be taken in seconds, and that sometimes adults choose silence not because they are weak, but because they are thinking. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. No rage. No revenge fantasies. Just clarity. I realized something important. People who humiliate others in public rely on one belief: that time will protect them. That memory fades. That shame belongs only to the victim. They were wrong. I didn't plan revenge the way movies show it. No dramatic vows. No sudden transformation. I simply adjusted how I moved through the world. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped seeking approval. I started watching, listening, learning where their confidence came from, and how fragile it actually was. Over the following months, I noticed patterns. David liked control. Linda liked appearances. Michael liked safety. None of them liked accountability. They spoke freely when they thought no one important was listening. They cut corners. They dismissed people quietly. They assumed I was still the same man who stood there smiling, doing nothing. And I let them keep believing that. My daughter changed too. She became quieter around them. More observant. She watched how I responded, not with bitterness, but with patience. I never spoke badly about them in front of her. Never poisoned her mind. I wanted her to see something different. That strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Before we continue, Tell me something. Which country are you watching this video from right now? Drop it in the comments. Every story feels more real when I know who's listening. Time passed. A year. Then another. People assume revenge fades when time passes. In truth, time sharpens it, if you use it wisely. While they moved forward carelessly, I moved forward deliberately. I rebuilt my professional life quietly. New connections. New credibility. No noise. There were moments when I could have confronted them. Moments when opportunities appeared to embarrass them back. I ignored those chances. Cheap revenge teaches nothing. I wanted something cleaner. Something that didn't require shouting or explanations. My daughter graduated high school during that period. I watched her confidence return, slowly. She stopped carrying that moment like a wound. She started seeing it as a lesson. That mattered to me more than any outcome involving them. The real shift came when David needed something. Life has a way of doing that. One email. Polite. Almost respectful. He framed it as collaboration. Opportunity. Mutual benefit. I read it twice and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No anger. Just confirmation. They had forgotten. That's when I understood. The most dangerous position you can be in is thinking the past is buried, when it's only waiting. I replied simply. Professional. Helpful. I agreed to listen. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the story wasn't finished yet. I agreed to meet him in a neutral place. Nothing dramatic. A quiet cafe near an office park. Glass walls. Neutral colors. The kind of place where people feel safe speaking freely because it looks clean and professional. David arrived early. That alone told me something. He was nervous, but he didn't want to look like it. When he stood up to shake my hand, his smile came a second too late. I noticed that. Small delays reveal big truths. His grip was firm, rehearsed. Mine was relaxed. I let him talk first. People always tell you who they are when you don't interrupt them. He spoke about new directions, about growth, about how things change. He never mentioned the past. Not once. That silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He wanted to reset the story without acknowledging what had already been written. I listened. I nodded. I asked simple questions. Not challenges. Just clarifications. Every answer he gave exposed more than he intended. He was under pressure. Financial pressure. Reputation pressure. Something wasn't working anymore. The confidence he once wore so easily had cracks now. At one point, he laughed lightly and said, "You always were the quiet type. Solid. Reliable." That word again. Reliable. It's what people call you when they think you won't fight back. I thanked him for the coffee. I told him I'd think about what he proposed. He tried to hide his disappointment when I didn't commit immediately. Tried to maintain control. I let him believe he still had some. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumph. I felt patience settling deeper. I understood the shape of what was coming, even if I didn't yet know the details. Revenge, when done right, doesn't rush toward an ending. It lets the ending come to it. At home, my daughter asked how the meeting went. She was older now. Sharper. She didn't ask out of curiosity. She asked because she sensed movement. It was calm, I said. That's usually when things are most honest. She nodded, as if she understood more than I expected. Maybe she did. Over the next few weeks, more messages came. From Linda this time. Friendly. Almost warm. She asked how I'd been. Complimented my daughter's achievements. Mentioned how proud she was of her. That word felt heavy in her mouth. Pride is easy to claim when you weren't there during the hard parts. I replied politely. Briefly. Never emotionally. I kept my distance without creating tension. Distance is powerful when others are trying to pull you closer for their own reasons. Michael reached out last. His message was careful, neutral. He asked if we could talk. Just talk. No agenda, he said. There's always an agenda. We met in his office. He closed the door softly behind us. He didn't sit right away. He paced for a moment. That told me everything. He was afraid of being associated with what was coming. I want to be clear, he said finally. I was never against you. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch. People rush to fill silence when they feel guilty. You were there, I said calmly. That's all that matters. He swallowed. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was new. Michael had always avoided conflict by pretending neutrality was morality. Now, that illusion wasn't holding up anymore. What none of them realized was that I wasn't collecting favors or planning a dramatic reveal. I was watching how they moved when pressure returned to their lives. Watching how quickly respect reappeared when they needed something. Watching how memory became selective when accountability approached. Meanwhile, my own life had changed in quieter ways. I had rebuilt my work with people who valued consistency over dominance. I had learned to speak less and document more. To observe patterns. To understand leverage without announcing it. My daughter saw these changes. She saw how I carried myself differently. Not bitter. Not defensive. Just grounded. One evening, she said something that stayed with me. You don't try to prove anything anymore, she said. I already know who I am, I replied. That's when I realized the revenge wasn't just about them. It was about what that humiliation had tried to take from me, my sense of authority in my own child's eyes. That authority wasn't loud. It came from steadiness. The situation escalated quietly. David's project began to unravel. Delays. Complaints. Questions from people who hadn't asked questions before. Linda's social confidence started to feel strained. Her appearances became more careful. Less bold. Michael stopped sending messages altogether. I was asked, indirectly, to step in. To advise. To consult. To help stabilize things. Each request came with respect that hadn't existed before. Respect offered late always reveals its true cost. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I said I'd review things. That word, review, gave me time. Time to see the full picture. Time to decide what kind of ending this story deserved. Late one night, I found myself thinking back to that moment years ago. The laughter. The casual cruelty. My daughter standing there, silent. I asked myself an honest question. If I had spoken up then, would it have changed anything? Or would it have only confirmed their narrative? I knew the answer. The power they thought they had over me was never real. It existed only because they believed I wouldn't outgrow it. People who humiliate others rarely imagine a future where the balance shifts. They live in permanent present tense. I had moved beyond that tense. The call came on a Tuesday morning. David's voice was different now. No humor. No framing. Just urgency disguised as professionalism. He needed a decision. I told him I would meet again. One last time. When I hung up, my daughter looked at me from across the room. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had learned something important over the years, that quiet doesn't mean passive, and patience doesn't mean weak. As I prepared for that meeting, I wasn't rehearsing words. I wasn't planning confrontation. I was preparing to let consequences speak for themselves. That's the cleanest form of justice there is. They had once believed I would never be in a position to choose. They were about to learn how wrong that belief was. The final meeting took place in a boardroom that tried too hard to feel impressive. Glass table. Leather chairs. City skyline framed like a promise behind them. David sat at the head, of course. Old habits cling longest when people feel threatened. Linda sat close enough to him that their shoulders almost touched. Michael chose a seat near the door. That choice wasn't accidental. They all stood when I entered. Years ago, they hadn't bothered. I took my time setting my folder on the table. I didn't rush to sit. I let the moment breathe. They were watching me now the way people watch something they don't fully understand but suspect they should respect. David began speaking before anyone else could. He thanked me for coming. He talked about timelines, expectations, and how valuable my input would be. He spoke as if we were equals who had always been equals. History rewritten in real time. I listened. I always did. When he finished, there was a pause. They expected me to fill it, to agree, to negotiate, to reassure. I didn't. I opened the folder slowly, not to intimidate them, but because slow movements make people uneasy when they're already uncertain. Inside were documents, emails, reports. Nothing dramatic on the surface. Just facts. Patterns. A quiet record of choices made when they thought no one was paying attention. I reviewed everything you sent, I said. My voice was calm, even. And some things you didn't. Linda shifted in her seat. Michael lowered his gaze. David's smile froze, just slightly. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I simply asked questions. Clear ones. Specific ones. Each question forced an answer. Each answer narrowed their room to maneuver. People underestimate how powerful questions can be when they're rooted in preparation. At one point, David interrupted me. Old instinct. Control reflex. I stopped speaking immediately and looked at him. Not angrily. Just directly. He cleared his throat and gestured for me to continue. That was new. As the conversation unfolded, something interesting happened. They stopped trying to impress me. They started trying to survive the meeting. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Linda tried to soften things. She spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about how hard things had been lately. She even mentioned my daughter again, complimented her, as if invoking her would remind me of my place. I let her finish. Then I said, "You spoke about my daughter once before." The room went quiet, not tense, just still. She was standing beside me, I continued. You may not remember. It didn't matter to you then. It mattered to her. No accusation, just a statement of fact. Linda's face changed. Not guilt. Recognition. She remembered now. Memory returns when consequences are present. David tried to redirect. He spoke about moving forward, about leaving the past behind. That phrase always sounds noble when spoken by people who benefited from the past. I agree, I said. That's why I'm here. That confused him. I explained my position clearly. I would not join their project. I would not attach my name to something built on instability. I wouldn't expose myself to risks I hadn't created. But I wouldn't obstruct them either. I didn't need to. The system they had designed was already doing that. What I offered instead was something else. Guidance. Quiet guidance. Behind the scenes. Limited. Documented. On my terms. No public association. No authority without accountability. David didn't like that. I could see it. His jaw tightened. He glanced at Linda, then at Michael. Neither of them supported him. That was the moment he realized he was alone. They needed me more than I needed them. That truth settled into the room like weight. After the meeting ended, Michael walked with me to the elevator. He thanked me. Sincerely this time. He said he had learned something from watching how I handled things. I believed him. Learning often comes late for people like Michael, but it does come. Linda sent a message later that evening. It was an apology. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Careful. Measured. The kind of apology people give when they finally understand that power doesn't protect them forever. I accepted it. Not because it erased the past, but because holding on to resentment would have taught my daughter the wrong lesson. David never apologized. He didn't need to. His silence told me everything. Some people can't apologize because doing so would require them to admit who they were when no one was watching. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Not triumph. Not victory. Balance. My daughter watched all of this quietly. One night, she asked me if I ever wished I had reacted differently back then. I thought about it before answering. No, I said. Because if I had, you would have learned how to shout. Instead, you learned how to wait. She smiled. Not proudly. Understandingly. That was when I knew the humiliation had failed. It had tried to shrink me in her eyes. Instead, it had expanded her understanding of strength. People often think revenge is about watching someone fall. It isn't. It's about watching yourself rise without becoming the thing that hurt you. I didn't need them to suffer publicly. I needed them to see me clearly, calm, unmoved, unbroken. Years later, I still think about that moment when they laughed. Not with anger. With perspective. They believed they were ending something. In reality, they were beginning it. The injustice didn't end with that meeting. It never does. What happened in front of my daughter was only the most visible moment, the kind people remember, but the real damage had started long before that, quietly, patiently, the way erosion works on stone. After that night years ago, when we drove home in silence, my life didn't fall apart dramatically. There was no collapse that others could point to and say, that's what broke him. Instead, things thinned out. Invitations slowed. Calls stopped coming. Doors didn't slam shut, they simply failed to open. That kind of exclusion is harder to explain and easier to deny. At the time, I was working in an environment where loyalty was praised publicly and punished privately. The rules were never written down. You learned them by watching who disappeared and who survived. I had always believed that consistency mattered. That showing up, doing the work, keeping your word, those things built a foundation. I was wrong about one thing. They only matter when people benefit from them. David had influence there. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that comes from being present at the right dinners, sitting on the right committees, knowing which favors to call in and which debts to ignore. Linda controlled perception. She remembered birthdays. She remembered names. She curated narratives with a smile. Michael ensured processes moved smoothly, or didn't. Together, they weren't cruel in obvious ways. They were efficient. And when someone became inconvenient, efficiency replaced empathy. My daughter didn't know any of this at first. She just sensed tension. She noticed that I worked longer hours but spoke less about my work. She noticed that my confidence remained, but my enthusiasm had dulled. Children notice absence before they understand cause. I shielded her from as much as I could. Not because I wanted to lie, but because I wanted her to grow up believing effort still meant something. That belief matters. Once it's gone, it's hard to rebuild. The humiliation at that gathering didn't come out of nowhere. It came from months of quiet dismissal. From decisions made without me. From credit redistributed subtly. From jokes disguised as concern. They had already decided who I was, and more importantly, who I wasn't allowed to become. After that night, I made a choice that didn't feel dramatic at the time. I stopped trying to correct their version of me. Correcting someone else's narrative is exhausting, and it rarely works. Instead, I focused on understanding it. Why did they need me to be small? Why did my presence threaten their balance? The answers revealed themselves slowly. I had a habit they didn't like. I remembered details. I documented conversations. I asked follow-up questions. Not aggressively. Casually. The kind that linger. People who rely on ambiguity hate clarity. I began to realize that my removal from influence wasn't about performance. It was about predictability. They couldn't predict me anymore. And unpredictability scares people who depend on control. At home, life went on. Mornings. School runs. Quiet dinners. My daughter grew taller. More observant. She asked better questions. She noticed how adults contradicted themselves. She noticed who apologized and who didn't. She was learning lessons I hadn't planned to teach her yet. One evening, while helping her with a project, she asked me why some people act kind in public and harsh in private. I said, because kindness is cheaper when it's witnessed. She thought about that. Then she said, so what's expensive kindness? I smiled. Doing the right thing when no one is watching. That was the kind of lesson I wanted her to carry, even if it cost me something in the short term. Professionally, I began laying quiet groundwork. Nothing dramatic. I reconnected with people I trusted. I updated records. I learned new systems. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't need applause. I needed options. People often misunderstand patience. They think it means waiting passively. It doesn't. It means preparing without broadcasting. The more I stepped back publicly, the more comfortable David became. He spoke more freely in meetings. He summarized decisions without checking facts. Linda curated stories that centered herself as the stabilizing force. Michael signed off on processes he hadn't fully reviewed. They weren't bad people. They were careless ones. Carelessness accumulates. I watched all of it without comment. At home, my daughter began asking about the future. College. Careers. Independence. I encouraged her curiosity without directing it. I wanted her to choose a path, not inherit one. Watching her think critically gave me a strange kind of peace. Even if my professional world felt unstable, something important was solid. There were moments when resentment crept in. Quiet ones. Late at night. When I replayed conversations and imagined saying what I hadn't said. That's normal. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But resentment didn't stay long. It didn't have room to settle. I was too busy building something else. The day I realized things were shifting was ordinary. That's how it usually happens. An email arrived asking for clarification on a decision David had made months earlier. Then another. Then a request for documentation. Nothing accusatory. Just questions. The kind that don't go away until answered properly. David forwarded one of those emails to me with a short note. Do you remember this? I did. Of course I did. I had saved it. I replied with the document attached. No commentary. No tone. Just evidence. That was the first crack. From there, the setup unfolded slowly. Meetings became longer. Decisions required more approval. Linda's polished explanations started sounding rehearsed. Michael began asking for reassurance before signing anything. They didn't connect these developments to me. Not consciously. They thought the environment had changed. Regulations. Expectations. Pressure. They never suspect the quiet person they dismissed, because dismissal creates blind spots. At home, my daughter noticed my calm returning. Not the forced calm of endurance, but the grounded calm of direction. She didn't ask why. She trusted it. Trust is built when children see consistency over time. I thought often about that moment of humiliation, not with pain, but with analysis. They had humiliated me because they thought I was alone, that I had no leverage, no future beyond their approval. That assumption shaped every choice they made afterward. Assumptions are dangerous things. They age poorly. Part of me wondered if they would ever recognize the full picture, if there would be a moment of realization. But I learned something important during that period. Understanding isn't required for justice to work. Consequences don't need comprehension. They only need alignment. I wasn't moving toward revenge. I was moving toward alignment. Between truth and outcome. Between behavior and result. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ground beneath them began to shift. Not because I pushed it, but because they had built it unevenly from the start. The shift wasn't announced. It never is. People imagine turning points as loud events, but real ones arrive quietly, disguised as routine. A meeting that runs longer than expected. A question that doesn't get brushed aside. A pause where confidence used to live. David started arriving early again. Not because he was eager, because he was uneasy. He checked his phone more often. Asked for summaries instead of issuing instructions. When people begin asking instead of telling, something inside them has already changed. Linda adapted faster. She always did. Her warmth became strategic. She scheduled more check-ins. Sent follow-up messages thanking people for their support. She sensed the temperature dropping and tried to raise it with charm. Charm works until facts arrive. Facts don't respond to tone. Michael became careful. Painfully careful. He started documenting conversations. Asking for confirmation in writing. That was almost amusing, considering how long I had done the same thing without acknowledgement. Behavior reveals fear long before words do. I stayed where I was. Quiet. Present. Available, but not eager. There's a difference. Eagerness seeks approval. Availability signals strength. One afternoon, my daughter came home frustrated. Not angry, thoughtful. She had been part of a group project where one person took credit for everyone's work. She asked me what I would do. I didn't answer right away. I asked her what she had noticed. That person talks the most, she said, but never listens. And who actually did the work? I asked. She smiled slightly. Everyone else. I nodded. Then let the results speak. She frowned. That doesn't feel fair. No, I said. But it feels true. Fairness comes later. Truth comes first. She thought about that longer than she admitted. Watching her navigate her own small injustices reminded me why I chose restraint instead of confrontation. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was modeling something for her. At work, a review process began. Officially routine. Unofficially overdue. People were asked to explain decisions made years earlier. Context mattered now. Memory mattered. Documentation mattered. Those who relied on charisma struggled. Those who relied on records didn't. David called me one evening. Not formal. Not friendly. Honest. For once. I feel like I'm missing something, he said. That happens, I replied. He waited, as if expecting me to elaborate. I didn't. Silence teaches faster than lectures. I never meant to push you out, he added. Intent is a comforting word people use when impact becomes inconvenient. I let it pass. I know, I said. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Linda reached out soon after. She asked if we could talk, not about work, she said, but about how things feel. I agreed. We met briefly. She spoke about stress, about pressure, about how difficult leadership can be. I listened. Then I asked one question. Do you remember the night you spoke about me in front of my daughter? She inhaled sharply. She did now. She apologized again. More openly this time. Not because she suddenly understood empathy, but because she understood vulnerability. Hers. I accepted it calmly. Not graciously. Not coldly. Simply neutrally. Forgiveness doesn't require emotion. It requires clarity. As these conversations unfolded, something else happened. People started coming to me quietly. Not to gossip. To ask how to handle situations. How to phrase concerns. How to protect themselves without escalating conflict. I became a reference point, not officially, but functionally. That's how influence really works. It migrates. My daughter noticed the change without knowing the details. She noticed my evenings were lighter, that I spoke about work without tension, that I laughed more easily. Children track emotional weather better than adults. One night she said, "You seem steady." "I feel aligned," I replied. She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. Alignment feels different. It doesn't rush. It doesn't justify itself. David's authority thinned gradually. Not stripped away, redistributed. Decisions required consensus. Oversight increased. The system adjusted around him without announcing why. That's the most effective correction there is. No villain. No hero. Just consequence. He tried to regain footing. Held meetings. Spoke confidently. But confidence without grounding sounds hollow. People hear it. They always do. Michael transferred departments. Officially a lateral move. Unofficially an exit. He sent me a message before leaving. Thanked me for my integrity. That word felt heavy coming from him. I appreciated it anyway. Linda stayed. She adapted. People like Linda often survive by reshaping themselves just enough to remain relevant. Whether that change was real or cosmetic didn't matter to me anymore. My involvement had limits now. Through all of this, I never announced my perspective. Never claimed credit. Never corrected anyone publicly. That restraint confused some people. They expected triumph. Or bitterness. I offered neither. The truth was simpler. I wasn't interested in winning. I was interested in ending something unhealthy without creating something worse. My daughter graduated soon after. Watching her walk across that stage, confident and self-possessed, I felt a deeper satisfaction than any professional shift could offer. She had watched me absorb injustice without becoming brittle. She had learned that dignity doesn't need witnesses. Later that evening, she hugged me and said, "I know you didn't say much back then, but I always felt safe with you." That was the moment everything settled. The humiliation had tried to teach her that respect comes from dominance. Instead, she learned it comes from steadiness. From not letting others define your reactions. From trusting time to do what shouting never can. Looking back, I see how easily I could have taken another path. Confrontation. Retaliation. Public exposure. It would have felt satisfying for a moment. It would have taught her the wrong lesson forever. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with redistribution. With gravity shifting. With people realizing too late that they dismissed the one person who understood the system better than they did. And when that realization comes, it doesn't need commentary. It needs silence. That silence did the work I never had to do myself. The weeks that followed felt lighter, but not celebratory. That distinction mattered to me. Celebration suggests an ending. What I was experiencing was balance returning. Slowly, naturally, without anyone needing to declare it. David's presence diminished. Not physically at first. He still occupied the same office, the same seat at the table. But people no longer leaned toward him when decisions were discussed. They didn't wait for his reaction before offering their own. Influence doesn't disappear overnight. It fades when others stop feeding it. I watched this happen without satisfaction. Satisfaction would have tied my peace to his decline. I didn't want that kind of dependency. I wanted independence. Emotional, professional, internal. Linda adjusted her tone around me. She chose words carefully now. She avoided humor that landed too sharply. Once, during a meeting, she started to make a comment, the kind that would have once diminished someone quietly, and stopped herself mid-sentence. She glanced at me, then continued more thoughtfully. That moment told me more than any apology ever could. People change when they feel observed. Not watched, understood. At home, my daughter prepared for a new chapter. She talked about moving away. About building her own life. I listened without clinging. That's another lesson parents learn late. Holding too tightly teaches fear, not love. One evening, she asked me if I ever felt angry anymore. I considered the question honestly. Anger visits, I said. But it doesn't stay. She nodded. I think that's strength. I smiled. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles. Professionally, I began receiving offers. Quiet ones. Not flashy promotions or public recognition. Invitations to contribute. To advise. To step into spaces where my voice carried weight without needing volume. I chose carefully. Not everything deserved my energy. David noticed. Of course he did. People notice when someone they once overlooked becomes unavailable. He tried to reassert familiarity. Casual greetings. Shared memories. I met them politely, but without warmth. Not cold, neutral. Neutrality frustrates those who rely on emotional leverage. One afternoon, he asked if we could talk privately. We sat in his office. The same one where years earlier decisions had been made without me. The same walls. The same desk. Different balance. I feel like I lost your respect, he said. I appreciated his honesty, even if it came late. I never gave it to you to lose, I replied. He absorbed that slowly. I thought you were passive, he admitted. That's common, I said. Still costly. He didn't argue. That was the closest he would ever come to accountability. I didn't push further. Pushing would have been about ego. I had moved past that. As time went on, the system corrected itself more fully. Reviews concluded. Structures adjusted. Credit redistributed. No announcements. No headlines. Just quiet recalibration. The kind that lasts. I noticed something else during that period. People around me began standing up for themselves more calmly. They documented. They asked questions. They paused instead of reacting. Influence spreads through example, not instruction. My daughter left for college soon after. Helping her pack, I thought about the night of that humiliation again. How close I had come to reacting. How easy it would have been to teach her a different lesson. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. You taught me that I don't have to prove my worth to people who don't protect it. That was enough. After she moved, the house felt quieter. Not lonely. Reflective. I had space to think without urgency. Space to look back without resentment. I realized then that the revenge wasn't a moment. It was a transformation. Not of them, of me. They had tried to define my value publicly. I had reclaimed it privately. That's a deeper victory. People sometimes ask why I didn't confront them directly back then. Why I didn't defend myself in front of my daughter. The answer is simple. Defense assumes accusation matters. Silence assumes truth survives. Years later, I still cross paths with some of them. Briefly. Cordially. Without history weighing down the present. David avoids my eyes now. Linda nods politely. Michael is gone. Life moved them where they belonged. And me? I'm steady. I learned that dignity isn't reclaimed through confrontation. It's reclaimed through consistency. Through letting time expose what words never could. Sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation is not reaction, but evolution. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones your children remember most. The danger didn't arrive as a threat. It came disguised as opportunity, which is how it usually comes when people believe you've forgotten what they did. After my daughter left for college, my life entered a quieter phase. Not empty, deliberate. I worked with fewer people, but better ones. Conversations were shorter. Expectations were clearer. I had learned to value precision over volume. That was when the invitation arrived. It wasn't from David directly. It never is when pride is involved. It came through a mutual contact, someone neutral enough to make it feel organic. The message was framed as collaboration. A chance to contribute to something significant. The tone suggested respect. The timing suggested need. I didn't respond right away. That pause mattered more than any answer. When I finally agreed to listen, not commit, listen, I already knew something was wrong. Opportunities don't chase you when they're clean. They wait. This one followed up too quickly. The first meeting was virtual. Faces arranged neatly in squares. Smiles practiced. Language careful. I recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't about my expertise alone. It was about my credibility. They needed someone whose presence would calm concerns they hadn't yet admitted publicly. David was there. He looked older. Not physically, structurally. The confidence that once flowed easily now came in controlled bursts. Linda appeared polished as ever, but less relaxed. Michael wasn't present. That absence was telling. They spoke about expansion, about growth, about lessons learned. People often speak about lessons when they're trying to outrun them. I listened without comment. At one point, David said, "We trust your judgment." That sentence hung in the air longer than he expected. Trust is a heavy word when it's offered late. I asked simple questions. About risk. About oversight. About accountability. The answers were vague. Optimistic. Framed in future tense. I had learned to be wary of futures that relied on hope instead of structure. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Not considering whether to help, considering whether this situation would test the lesson I had tried to teach my daughter. People often think rising conflict means raised voices or open hostility. It doesn't. It means pressure building behind politeness. It means choices presented as favors. It means being asked to absorb risk for someone else's benefit. Over the next weeks, more details emerged. Documents, proposals, projections. And in those details, I saw the danger clearly. Corners had been cut again. Not recklessly, confidently. The same habits, different context. David reached out privately this time. No intermediary. That alone was significant. "We need you involved," he said. "Need strips language down to honesty." "I won't be," I replied. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because the structure hasn't changed," I said. "Only the pressure has." He tried to persuade. Spoke about trust rebuilt. About shared history. About moving past old mistakes. Mistakes is a generous word for patterns. "I don't move past things that haven't been corrected," I said. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Arguments require leverage. After that conversation, the tone shifted. Subtly at first. Messages cooled. Timelines tightened. The invitation transformed into expectation. When that didn't work, expectation edged toward implication. That's when I knew the conflict had entered its next phase. They began referencing my involvement publicly, carefully, vaguely, as if association were already secured. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was an assumption presented confidently enough to become truth if unchallenged. I challenged it quietly. I clarified my position in writing. Briefly. Factually. I didn't accuse. I corrected. Correction unsettles people more than accusation because it implies authority. Linda responded quickly. Apologetic. Smooth. She explained it as a misunderstanding. A miscommunication. Those words are used when responsibility is being passed around discreetly. I accepted the explanation. Then I sent a follow-up clarifying that my name was not to be used in any capacity without explicit consent. After that, communication slowed again. At home, alone now, I reflected on how familiar this felt. Different stage. Same behaviors. The danger wasn't that they would humiliate me again. It was that they would try to benefit from my restraint without respecting its boundaries. That's when restraint becomes vulnerability, unless it's paired with clarity. I had clarity. I also had records. Over the years, I had kept everything. Not obsessively. Intentionally. Conversations. Emails. Proposals. Versions. Patterns. Not for revenge, for accuracy. Accuracy is protection. When the project encountered resistance, external questions, regulatory concerns, partner hesitation, my name surfaced again. This time not as collaborator, but as reassurance. Someone contacted me directly, asked if I was involved. I answered truthfully. Simply. No commentary. No. That answer traveled faster than any rumor. Within days, the tone shifted again. Urgent now. Meetings scheduled hastily. David called twice in one afternoon. I didn't answer. People reveal their true priorities when pressure compresses time. Eventually, he sent a message I hadn't expected. "I think we're about to make a mistake," he wrote. That sentence told me everything. Not "I made a mistake." Not "we treated you unfairly." Just "we're about to." People often only recognize danger when it threatens them directly. I replied once. Then stop. No explanation. No advice. I wasn't interested in saving them from themselves anymore. I had already saved myself, and taught my daughter how to do the same. The conflict escalated without me lifting a finger. Questions multiplied. Oversight increased. Confidence fractured. The same habits that had once protected them now exposed them. I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction. With confirmation. This was the rising conflict. Not between us, but between who they believed themselves to be and what they had consistently chosen to do. And conflict like that always resolves itself. Quietly. Inevitably. The pressure didn't break them immediately. It tightened. Slowly. Like a hand closing, not to crush, but to test resistance. People reveal more under sustained pressure than sudden shock. David began sending longer messages. Not angry. Careful. Structured. He framed each one as collaboration, but the subtext was urgency. Timelines. Stakeholders. Reputational risk. Words designed to make someone feel responsible without formally assigning responsibility. I didn't respond. Silence is unsettling when people expect negotiation. It denies them traction. Linda tried a different approach. She reached out personally, not professionally. Asked how I was adjusting to life with my daughter away. Spoke about her own family. About how we're all just trying to do our best. That phrase carries a lot of cover. I listened politely when we spoke. Then I said something she didn't expect. "You don't need me to feel better about this." She paused. "I need you to be clear," I continued. "And I already am." She didn't push after that. Linda knew when not to. Survival instinct. Michael resurfaced briefly, indirectly. Someone mentioned his name in connection with the project. Consulting. Oversight. He had always been good at appearing just far enough away to deny responsibility while staying close enough to benefit. That pattern didn't hold this time. External scrutiny increased. Not dramatic investigations. Just inquiries. Requests for clarification. Requests for documentation. The kind that don't accuse but don't leave either. The irony was quiet and precise. The very systems they had once used to marginalize me, process, procedure, hierarchy, were now turning inward. I received a call from someone I respected. Neutral. Come. They asked if I had concerns about the project. I answered honestly. "I have observations," I said. "Concerns imply investment." That distinction mattered. "What are the observations?" they asked. I shared them. Not opinions. Facts. Patterns. Historical context. No speculation. No emotion. Just alignment between record and reality. When the call ended, I felt no relief. Just completion. I had done what was correct, not what was satisfying. David called again that evening. His voice had changed. Not defensive. Exposed. "I think we're losing control of this," he said. Control. That word again. "You never had it," I replied. "You only had momentum." He exhaled slowly. "I should have listened to you years ago," he said. That was the closest thing to regret I would ever hear from him. I didn't respond. Regret spoken too late becomes self-soothing. The days that followed were tense for them. I could feel it in the way messages stopped coming. In the way my name was no longer mentioned at all. They had shifted strategies, from inclusion to insulation. That's a dangerous move. Insulation fails under heat. Meanwhile, my daughter called more often. Not because she sensed trouble, Because she was learning to articulate her own challenges. Roommates. Expectations. Power dynamics. The same patterns, smaller stage. I listened. I didn't solve. I asked questions. What do you notice? What feels familiar? What feels wrong? She answered thoughtfully. She was learning discernment. That mattered more than advice. One evening, she said something that aligned everything. I think some people confuse being calm with being available. I smiled. She had learned. Back in my own world, the conflict reached a quiet peak. The project stalled. Not publicly. Internally. Decisions delayed. Support hesitated. Momentum reversed. David sent one final message. If this collapses, it will affect a lot of people. That sentence was designed to transfer moral weight. I replied once. Then you should have protected it earlier. No accusation. Just cause and effect. After that, there was nothing more to say. Weeks passed. Then months. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. The project didn't fail dramatically. It was restructured. Scaled down. Leadership adjusted. Narratives softened. No one called it what it was. They never do. David stepped aside quietly. Linda remained, repositioned. Michael was nowhere to be found. And me? I remained exactly where I had chosen to stand, outside the blast radius, inside my integrity. People sometimes think restraint means avoiding conflict. It doesn't. It means choosing which conflicts deserve your energy. This one had taught me everything it could. The rising conflict wasn't about revenge. It was about repetition. Patterns repeating until they meet resistance, not from confrontation, but from consequence. I didn't need to push. I had learned to step aside and let gravity do the work. And gravity, unlike people, never forgets. The aftermath didn't announce itself. There was no moment where everyone suddenly understood what had happened. Instead, there was a quiet settling, like dust after a structure collapses inward rather than outward. I noticed it first in the absence of noise. No more messages framed as urgency. No more invitations disguised as favors. No more careful checking of my availability. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't imposed. It was chosen. David disappeared from my professional orbit entirely. Not abruptly. Gradually. His name stopped coming up in conversations. His influence thinned until it became irrelevant. That's how reputations actually end, not with scandal, but with irrelevance. Linda remained visible. She always would. People like her adapt because they sense shifts before others do. She learned to speak more carefully, to include more voices, to document more clearly. Whether that change came from reflection or fear didn't matter. Behavior is what shapes outcomes, not motivation. Michael never resurfaced. I wasn't surprised. People who avoid accountability often vanish when systems begin remembering. I had expected to feel something, satisfaction, maybe, or closure. What I felt instead was clarity. The kind that doesn't need reinforcement. I thought often about how easily this could have gone another way. How, if I had agreed to attach my name early on, I would have been absorbed into the consequences. Shared responsibility for decisions I didn't make. Shared blame for structures I didn't design. Restraint had protected me again. One afternoon, I was asked to speak with a small group, not formally, not publicly, just to share perspective. They wanted to understand how certain patterns repeat in organizations without anyone intending harm. I spoke carefully. I didn't mention names. I didn't frame it as warning. I framed it as observation. When people confuse confidence with clarity, I said, they stop listening. And when listening stops, mistakes begin to sound like strategy. They listened. Not because I was persuasive, because the evidence was recent. That night, my daughter called. She had faced a situation where someone tried to pressure her into agreeing to something vague, something that felt off but wasn't obviously wrong. She said no. calmly, without apology. "I remembered what you said," she told me, "about futures built on hope instead of structure." I closed my eyes for a moment after we hung up. That was the real turning point. Not the project. Not David's decline. That call. I realized then that the danger I had navigated wasn't just professional. It was generational. Patterns repeat because they're tolerated. They end when someone learns to recognize them early and step away. Over time, new opportunities came. Better ones. Cleaner ones. Not because I chased them, but because my boundaries filtered them. That's something people don't talk about enough. Boundaries don't limit possibility. They refine it. Occasionally, I would hear fragments of the old story from others. Rewritten. Softened. Responsibility dispersed until it became no one's fault. That's normal. Systems protect themselves by erasing edges. I didn't correct those narratives. Correction would have reinserted me into a story I had already outgrown. Instead, I focused on the present. On work that made sense. On conversations that didn't require translation. On relationships that didn't rely on silence for survival. One evening, walking alone, I thought again about that first humiliation. The laughter. The casual cruelty. The assumption that I would remain small. They had mistaken my silence for absence. It was never absence. It was accumulation. People often underestimate what quiet people are doing when they're not speaking. They assume nothing is happening. That assumption becomes their blind spot. The rising conflict had reached its natural conclusion, not with confrontation, but with separation. I had separated myself from outcomes I didn't believe in. They had separated themselves from stability they once took for granted. And my daughter, she was learning to do the same. To walk away early. To trust her instincts. To choose clarity over acceptance. That's when I understood something important. Revenge isn't always about reversal. Sometimes it's about refusal. Refusing to participate. Refusing to validate. Refusing to carry consequences that aren't yours. The conflict didn't make me harder. It made me cleaner. And clean boundaries have a way of exposing everything they touch. The danger had passed, not because it was confronted, but because it was recognized in time. That recognition changed everything. The turning point didn't feel like a decision. It felt like alignment clicking into place. The moment when everything that had been observed, endured, and quietly recorded finally began pointing in the same direction. I hadn't planned to act. That's important. Action born from planning often carries ego with it. What happened next came from position, not intention. The request arrived formally this time. No soft language. No friendly framing. A direct inquiry from an oversight body connected to the industry. Neutral. Procedural. Unemotional. They wanted clarity about historical processes, decision trails, and accountability gaps. They wanted context. Context is dangerous for people who survive on ambiguity. I agreed to speak. Not to accuse. Not to defend. To clarify. Before the meeting, I sat alone and asked myself one question. What does justice look like here? Not punishment. Not exposure. Justice. The answer was simple. Justice meant accuracy. Letting the full picture exist without distortion. In the meeting, I spoke slowly. I described timelines. I explained how decisions were framed versus how they were executed. I pointed out where responsibility was diffuse by design. I referenced documents when asked. Nothing more. Nothing less. At one point, someone asked why I hadn't raised concerns earlier. I did, I said. Quietly. Repeatedly. And then I adjusted my involvement accordingly. That answer landed. After the meeting ended, I felt no rush. No relief. Just completion. Like setting something down that had been carried long enough. Days later, updates filtered back indirectly. Leadership structures were being reviewed. Roles clarified. Safeguards introduced. Not as reaction, as correction. The language mattered. Reaction is emotional. Correction is systemic. David's name surfaced again, briefly. Not in accusation. In assessment. His decisions were examined in sequence, not isolation. Patterns don't defend well when laid end to end. Linda was interviewed. She cooperated fully. Adaptation again. Michael's absence was noted. Absence always speaks louder when accountability arrives. Through all of this, I remained peripheral. That was intentional. Justice doesn't need proximity to ego. It needs distance from interference. My daughter called during this period, excited about something small, a class she loved, a conversation that challenged her thinking. She didn't know what was unfolding in my professional world, and I didn't tell her. She didn't need to inherit that weight. Listening to her talk, I realized the true turning point wasn't external at all. It was internal. I no longer felt the need to be understood by people who had once dismissed me. Understanding had become optional. That freedom is dangerous to systems built on dominance. A week later, David reached out. One last time. His message wasn't defensive. It wasn't persuasive. It was stripped of posture. "I see it now," he wrote. I didn't ask what he meant. "I should have listened," he added. Listening requires humility. Humility often arrives after consequence. I replied politely, briefly, without reopening doors. "I hope you learn from it," I said. That was all. What followed wasn't collapse. It was reconfiguration. David transitioned out. Officially mutual. Unofficially inevitable. Linda remained, but with boundaries she hadn't faced before. Oversight became real. Processes tightened. No one framed it as justice. That word makes people uncomfortable. They framed it as improvement. Progress. Maturity. I didn't correct them. At home, alone again, I reflected on how quietly power can move when it's no longer attached to performance. How effective silence becomes when it's paired with preparation. The humiliation years ago had tried to reduce me in my daughter's eyes. Instead, it had forced me to grow in ways I hadn't planned. It taught me patience without passivity, observation without resentment, action without aggression. That's when I understood the turning point fully. Revenge didn't arrive as a strike. It arrived as a shift, where the system that once enabled humiliation could no longer sustain itself unchanged. And I didn't have to push. I only had to stop carrying what wasn't mine. Sometimes the smartest revenge is letting truth walk into rooms where lies once felt comfortable. And when that happens, everything rearranges itself naturally. The shift that had begun quietly started to ripple outward, subtle at first, but unstoppable once it reached momentum. I watched it with a detached attention, knowing that interference now would have been unnecessary. The system would do the work itself. People rarely realize the consequences of their own choices until patterns collide with reality. David tried, briefly, to reassert control. He sent updates, proposed meetings, highlighted efficiency gaps. Polished emails, carefully worded, all designed to signal authority while masking uncertainty. But influence is fragile when credibility has been quietly undermined over time. Those who relied on his guidance began seeking verification elsewhere. Requests that once flowed naturally through him were rerouted. Questions arrived to me, not because I sought them, but because people were looking for clarity he could no longer guarantee. Linda, predictably, adapted faster. She began attending meetings prepared with supporting documents, reciting facts, and providing cross-references. Her charm, which had once been her shield, became part of her armor. People noticed she was more cautious, more deliberate. She no longer casually dismissed concerns or assumed agreement. The same habits that had once protected her were now keeping her in check. Michael never returned. That absence, once convenient for him, now became noticeable. Roles had shifted, processes clarified, and responsibilities no longer allowed ambiguity. The structure, once uneven, had leveled. His name occasionally appeared in documents as a prior signatory or point of contact, but no longer carried weight. The gap he left amplified the systemic recalibration. Through it all, I maintained my position. Peripheral, neutral, unassuming. That was deliberate. Presence without visibility is more powerful than visibility without presence. I didn't need to participate in daily operations or assert control. I only needed to remain prepared to answer questions accurately and consistently when asked. One morning, I received an email from a neutral industry oversight office. They requested clarification on a series of procedural decisions spanning several years. Not accusatory. Not investigative in tone. Procedural. Factual. My reply was meticulous, referencing documents, timelines, and meeting notes. No commentary, no judgment. Just accuracy. The effect was instantaneous. Decisions were reviewed, timelines adjusted, and roles clarified. People who had relied on ambiguity suddenly found themselves under scrutiny they could not influence. Processes that had been flexible for years were now fixed. Momentum had shifted, and it wasn't coming back. David reached out after this indirectly, through a mutual contact. His message was careful, almost formal. I realize the oversight has highlighted gaps we didn't anticipate. I value your perspective. I read it and didn't respond immediately. There was no need. His acknowledgement alone revealed more than any words could have. When someone recognizes the pattern of their own failure, that recognition is a kind of surrender. Linda's approach, meanwhile, became procedural. Her adaptability allowed her to remain relevant, but with new constraints. She began documenting everything: decisions, approvals, follow-ups. Charm was no longer sufficient. Compliance now dictated influence. The same tools that had once kept her comfortable were now keeping her accountable. In the quiet moments, I reflected on my daughter. She had grown into a young woman capable of discerning subtleties, recognizing imbalance, and refusing to accept authority without clarity. Watching her navigate small conflicts at college, I noticed the lessons from years of restraint were taking root. One evening, she called me, sharing an experience from a group project. A teammate tried to dominate the discussion, sidestepping evidence and facts to assert authority. She told me how she paused, asked questions, and redirected the focus to documented points. I felt nervous at first, she said. But it worked. People listened. I smiled. That was the real payoff. Not the system adjusting around David, Linda, and Michael. Not the quiet reshaping of professional influence. The lesson I had taught, patience, preparation, discernment, and measured action, was now living in her. Meanwhile, the final cracks in the old system became evident. The project, once lauded internally, faced delays, oversight challenges, and required restructuring. No one assigned blame publicly, but internally, the recalibration was unavoidable. Decisions previously taken for granted were now scrutinized. Responsibility, which had been diffuse, became traceable. Patterns of avoidance and reliance on ambiguous authority were corrected, naturally. David attempted one more direct conversation with me, brief and neutral. His tone lacked defensiveness, replaced with an unfamiliar humility. I think we underestimated how patterns repeat, he said. Patterns are predictable, I replied simply. That was enough. No lecture, no judgment. Recognition doesn't require argument. I realized that the turning point wasn't simply external consequences. It was internal alignment. My own understanding of what justice and consequence meant. The humiliation, the slow erosion of influence, the repeated attempts at undermining my position, all served as preparation. Patience had become strategy. Silence had become leverage. Observation had become power. The external adjustments, David stepping aside, Linda recalibrating, Michael absent, were consequences, yes. But the deeper transformation was in perspective. People learned, slowly, that the structures they relied on to manipulate outcomes were no longer effective when met with preparation, clarity, and restraint. And the most important lesson, real influence doesn't require control over others. It requires control over your own actions and your response to theirs. That is the turning point no one notices until much later. By the end of the segment, the project was stable, oversight was intact, and the system had corrected itself without confrontation, without exposure, without public spectacle. The quiet patience I had cultivated allowed the inevitable consequences to unfold naturally, without my intervention beyond factual clarity. And in that unfolding, the people who had once underestimated me were left to adjust. Their patterns, once hidden, had been exposed, not aggressively, not publicly, but systematically, naturally, and irrevocably. The turning point had arrived. And it had arrived quietly, as all the best strategies do. The system had shifted, but the final stage of this turning point wasn't in policies, oversight, or professional adjustments. It was in perception, how people understood themselves in relation to the consequences of their own actions. And perception is slower to realign than process. David's posture changed gradually. Meetings that once flowed through him now required preparation. His authority wasn't stripped, it was tempered by accuracy and documentation he could no longer ignore. The same confidence he had relied on to navigate ambiguity now worked against him, revealing gaps he had assumed were invisible. Every assertion required evidence. Every decision needed traceable logic. Momentum no longer protected him. Precision now dictated relevance. Linda adapted faster, but her adaptability carried a cost. She documented obsessively, referenced previous communications, and preemptively included confirmations from multiple parties. Charm no longer shielded her. Procedural rigor replaced it. She became highly efficient, but the fluid dominance she once wielded effortlessly was gone. Her influence remained, but it was contained, accountable, and visible, far from the unchecked sway she had once enjoyed. Michael's absence had a more subtle effect. By vanishing from the scene, he left a void that others were forced to fill. No longer could ambiguity shield decisions. No longer could responsibility be diffuse. The structures that had allowed carelessness to flourish were now corrected, internally, without any dramatic confrontation. And me, I observed. Always observed. Peripheral. Unassuming. Neutral. That stance, cultivated over years of restraint, allowed the system to correct itself naturally. My influence had never required me to dominate. It required me to prepare, document, and remain steady. Presence without interference was more powerful than visibility paired with conflict. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons my daughter had absorbed. She called frequently now, sharing stories of small confrontations, group projects, and situations where she had to assert clarity over authority. Each time she recounted a moment where she noticed imbalance or avoided unnecessary conflict, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The lesson had traveled beyond me. It lived in her. One afternoon, she described a situation with a college group leader. He attempted to bypass documented agreements, assuming compliance through intimidation. She paused, asked questions, referenced documented points, and redirected the group to evidence rather than assertion. She ended the conversation triumphantly, not through confrontation, but through clarity. I felt nervous at first, she admitted. But I knew what was right, and I stuck to it. I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. That was exactly the lesson I had hoped she would carry. Preparation, patience, and calm certainty outweigh aggression and posturing every time. Professionally, the final realignment unfolded over weeks. The project was restructured. Oversight was clarified. Decisions once vulnerable to ambiguity were now traceable. Patterns of avoidance, delay, and assumed authority had been corrected naturally, without spectacle. People began operating in alignment with systems they had previously circumvented. David sent one final note. Short, neutral, honest. I understand now how this unfolded. I didn't respond. Silence was sufficient. Recognition doesn't require validation. Linda's tone had shifted permanently. Procedural, precise, accountable. Charm remained, but tempered by method. Michael remained absent. The structures were corrected, and the balance restored, not through confrontation, not through public scrutiny, but through careful observation, prepared action, and patient restraint. The most powerful lesson revealed itself in reflection. Revenge, if it is to be meaningful, doesn't arrive through retribution. It arrives through patience, through preparation, through letting patterns collide naturally with the reality they have shaped. The humiliation my daughter had witnessed years before, which I had absorbed silently, became a teaching moment, not by words, but by example. Restraint, clarity, and integrity had corrected what arrogance and carelessness once had unchecked. I realized finally that this had never been about them. It had always been about alignment, aligning action with principle, response with consequence, patience with clarity. The system had corrected itself, but the real transformation had occurred internally. My response had never been reactive. It had been deliberate, grounded, and observant. And in that realization, I found peace. Not triumph, not satisfaction, peace. Because the lesson my daughter now carried was one I could not have given through words alone. It was demonstrated through decades of composed resilience, careful observation, and strategic patience. I understood then, the strongest form of moral justice is invisible. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't announce itself. It exists in the realignment of patterns, the restoration of clarity, and the lessons absorbed by those who watch carefully. As I sat alone, reflecting on the years of careful restraint, calculated patience, and quiet observation, I felt the weight lift completely. Not because the system had corrected itself, though it had, but because I had become the person I needed to be. Prepared, observant, grounded, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the quietest revenge, the one that doesn't scream or lash out, teaches the most enduring lessons. It teaches restraint. It teaches observation. It teaches the next generation, your daughter, in my case, that dignity, preparation, and clarity are stronger than power, charm, or intimidation. The turning point had arrived fully. Not with spectacle. Not with conflict. But with natural consequence and internal clarity. The world had corrected itself without my interference, and in the process, I had shown my daughter what patience, strategy, and quiet justice could achieve. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel calm. Not triumphant, not relieved, just calm. Because true alignment never demands recognition. It simply exists, inevitable, silent, and complete. The resolution began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact was absolute. People often expect justice to arrive with noise, with confrontation, with declarations. That is not how real accountability unfolds. True correction works subtly, naturally, and without fanfare, and by the time it's clear, it is too late for those who ignored the patterns before. David's influence had dwindled almost entirely. It wasn't dramatic. He wasn't fired. No one announced a downfall. He simply found that his decisions no longer carried the weight they once had. People began to ask questions he couldn't answer, requested clarifications he hadn't documented, and deferred to others who could provide precise information. Authority isn't taken away. It erodes when credibility doesn't support it. Linda remained in the organization, but her role had shifted. Her charm, once a tool that smoothed interactions and diffused accountability, was now balanced by rigorous documentation. Every decision was recorded. Every approval cross-checked. Her adaptability allowed her to remain relevant, but she operated under constraints she had never faced before. The same talents that had once allowed her to dominate now demanded accountability. Michael's absence left a gap that could not be ignored. He had relied on the invisibility of non-participation to shield himself. Now that absence amplified accountability for everyone else. Responsibilities previously dispersed were reassigned. The structure that once enabled evasion now reinforced integrity. I observed from the periphery. Not involved in the operational details, not seeking recognition, simply present and consistent. That stance, cultivated over years of careful restraint, had allowed the systems to correct themselves without me intervening directly. Observation, patience, and preparation had become my tools, not confrontation or accusation. The project that had been fraught with mismanagement and fragile decisions was restructured systematically. Oversight committees reviewed each phase. Decisions previously clouded by ambiguity were clarified and assigned proper responsibility. Policies and procedures were formalized. Errors that had been tolerated were corrected, not with punishment, but with structural adjustments that made recurrence impossible. David reached out to me one last time. His message was brief, neutral, and carried a tone I hadn't heard from him in years. I see now how this should have been handled. I understand my part. I did not respond. There was nothing to add. Recognition, even silent, is sufficient when it arrives voluntarily. Lessons learned too late are still valuable, but they don't require validation. Linda's recalibration was slower but equally visible. She began participating more responsibly, consulting records before issuing guidance, and avoiding assumptions. Her previous reliance on influence through personality had given way to influence through competence. In this new equilibrium, accountability replaced charm. At home, my daughter continued to grow into the lessons she had absorbed from observing my responses. She had learned to navigate small injustices with calm decisiveness, asking questions, referencing facts, and maintaining integrity without aggression. One evening, she recounted a situation where a peer attempted to assert dominance by exaggerating influence. She calmly questioned the assumptions, referenced documentation, and redirected the group to evidence. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said. "I just wanted to be clear." That clarity reflected the quiet principles I had instilled through example. Integrity, patience, and preparation had become practical tools, not abstract concepts. The lessons from my own experiences of humiliation were now living in her. Professionally, the final outcomes were subtle but profound. Projects continued under new structures, but the environment was different. Decision-making was more transparent. Responsibility was explicit. Patterns that had once allowed manipulation were corrected organically. The people who had previously relied on ambiguity now operated under constraints they could not evade. No one called it revenge. No one labeled it justice. That's how true resolution works. It exists without framing, without commentary, and without spectacle. Systems adjust. People adapt. Balance is restored. During this period, I received an unexpected message from a former colleague, neutral in position, someone I had trusted for years. "You handled everything with incredible composure. I've seen others lose themselves in anger, but you stayed steady. It made all the difference." I considered the compliment quietly. Composure isn't passive. It is intentional. It requires observation, patience, and control over one's own reactions. It teaches more than anger ever could. As the weeks passed, communication from David and Linda slowed further. Michael's name faded entirely. The professional ecosystem had recalibrated itself, leaving me uninvolved but influential through consistency and integrity. My presence had never needed to dominate. It had only needed to exist accurately and patiently. At home, life felt lighter. My daughter's confidence grew. She handled challenges calmly, relying on clarity and preparation instead of reaction. She was no longer a witness to humiliation. She was a participant in a new standard of integrity. The culmination of all these changes revealed something fundamental. Revenge isn't always about confrontation. It is about alignment, aligning your actions with principle, your responses with clarity, and your patience with inevitability. Humiliation, mismanagement, and carelessness will always encounter natural consequences when met with preparation and restraint. I reflected on the years leading up to this resolution. Each insult, each slight, each dismissal had been an opportunity to practice patience, to strengthen observation, and to maintain integrity. The lessons had been absorbed slowly, but the results were profound. Patterns that once seemed unchangeable were corrected not by force, but by presence and consistency. The final truth settled quietly. Justice, when earned through patient strategy and moral consistency, does not require noise. It unfolds naturally. People adjust, systems correct themselves, and the lessons endure, sometimes most powerfully in those who witness, rather than in those who are corrected. And in that quiet resolution, I found peace. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Peace. The lesson had been transmitted. The system had corrected itself. And my daughter, who had seen everything with youthful clarity, now understood what restraint, observation, and integrity could accomplish. The calm after the upheaval was not a sudden silence but a slow settling. Patterns that had once caused chaos now aligned with consequence. People had adjusted without confrontation, without spectacle. Authority, influence, and reputation, all the things that had once seemed unshakable, now rested on the foundations they had ignored for years: accountability, precision, and consistency. David's posture had transformed subtly. He no longer spoke with the same confident assumptions. Every decision required documentation, verification, and cross-checks. His influence, once unquestioned, was now tempered by clarity. He could not rely on momentum alone. He had to earn trust through evidence and careful follow-through. That shift was invisible externally, but devastating internally. The same habits that had allowed him to dominate effortlessly now highlighted his vulnerabilities. Linda adapted, as she always had. Her charm remained, but it now coexisted with meticulous preparation and accountability. She kept records of every approval, referenced emails for every assertion, and included multiple confirmations in all communications. The traits that once gave her advantage, quick wit, social ease, persuasive presence, were no longer sufficient alone. She was competent, yes, but she was also constrained. And that constraint came from the structure she had previously navigated as if it were secondary. Michael remained absent. He had chosen invisibility as his shield, but absence now amplified accountability for everyone else. His colleagues had no choice but to correct processes that had once relied on ambiguity. The systems he left behind were no longer flexible to human error or manipulation. The gaps he had once exploited now demanded attention from others. I watched all of this unfold without interference. My role was observational. Presence without engagement. Witness without intrusion. Over the years, I had learned that the most powerful influence does not shout. It waits, measures, and allows natural consequence to do the work. One morning, a neutral oversight office requested an update regarding procedural compliance and decision-making documentation. Not accusatory. Not aggressive. Just precise. Factual. They wanted clarification of responsibilities across a multi-year span, and I provided it meticulously. Every date. Every memo. Every meeting referenced. No commentary, no judgment. The ripple was immediate. Projects were reassessed. Leadership reviewed structures and decision-making channels. Responsibilities were clarified, traceable, and enforced. Patterns that had once permitted shortcuts and evasion were corrected, not through scandal or exposure, but by procedural realignment. Those who had depended on opacity were suddenly required to operate in light. David's final direct contact was brief. He admitted, without excuse, that he had misjudged the consequences of prior actions. Humility, when it arrives late, is often silent. I didn't reply. Recognition need not be validated. Linda's adaptation was more methodical. She maintained influence, yes, but every choice she made now carried traceable responsibility. She had retained skill, but it was restrained by necessity. The same abilities that once allowed freedom now demanded accountability. The resolution became clear to me: revenge is not always action against others. Sometimes, it is alignment with principle, patience, and preparation. The individuals involved learned lessons, but those lessons were imparted indirectly. Systems corrected themselves. Missteps that once remained invisible were illuminated through natural consequence. Meanwhile, at home, my daughter's growth mirrored these professional shifts. She faced conflicts at college, peer disputes, group dynamics, and ambiguous authority, and handled them with clarity. She questioned assumptions, referenced facts, and refused to accept decisions without rationale. One evening, she recounted a situation where a teammate attempted to assert control over a project by speaking confidently but without evidence. She calmly asked questions, referenced documentation, and redirected the group's focus to verified information. I didn't want to argue, she told me. I just wanted clarity. People followed me because it made sense. That statement carried more weight than any confrontation could. Lessons transmitted through example endure far longer than lessons imposed through discipline or outrage. What she learned in practice reflected the strategies I had cultivated: observation, patience, clarity, and integrity. Professionally, the final structural adjustments were subtle but absolute. Projects continued, but processes were now strict and accountable. Ambiguity, once a shield for carelessness, was eliminated. Decision-making was clear, roles were defined, and patterns that once allowed exploitation were corrected. David, Linda, and the absent Michael had all encountered the natural consequences of prior habits. No one labeled it revenge. No one called it justice. But to the careful observer, it was evident. Structures, accountability, and consequence had aligned without confrontation, without accusation, and without spectacle. Systems correct themselves when preparation, restraint, and patience are applied consistently. One day, I received a message from a neutral colleague, someone who had observed the entire process without taking sides. "You've handled this with composure I've rarely seen. Most people would have reacted in anger, but your patience guided the outcome perfectly." Composure is often misunderstood. It is not passivity. It is intentional restraint. It is observation turned into strategy. Composure allows lessons to unfold naturally, without forcing them, and that is the quietest and most effective form of influence. In the following weeks, communication from David and Linda slowed almost to nothing. Michael's absence remained permanent. The ecosystem around me had realigned organically. Influence, accountability, and operational balance had restored themselves. My own presence remained neutral, peripheral, yet inherently stabilizing. At home, life returned to a lighter rhythm. My daughter continued to exercise discernment and clarity in her decisions. She was no longer a witness to humiliation. She was a participant in integrity. She understood, not through lectures, but through observation, the strength in restraint, preparation, and accuracy.